The first time I saw the moving truck, I felt a flicker of hope. It's a peculiar thing, getting a new neighbor at my age. At 75, you stop expecting much change. The world becomes a series of familiar patterns. The sunrise through the kitchen window, the creak of the floorboards under my own weight, the way the light hits the portrait of my late wife, Margaret, on the mantelpiece every afternoon at 3 o'clock. For 42 years, this house has been my anchor. The neighbors have come and gone, but the rhythm of this street has always been a gentle, predictable hum. A new person could mean a new friend, someone to share a passing wave, perhaps, even a cup of tea on the porch when the evenings draw in. That flicker died a quick death. His name was Derek. He introduced himself with a handshake that was a little too firm, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was 42, he said, a man who gets things done. He said it while looking past my shoulder into the dim hall of my home, his gaze sweeping over the well-worn furniture and the dust moots dancing in the sunbeams. It was an assessing look, the kind a man gives a piece of machinery he's thinking of buying for parts. "Pleasure to meet you, sir," he'd said, the "sir" sounding like an afterthought, a placeholder for a word he wouldn't say aloud. Old-timer. Geezer. I played my part. I leaned a little heavier on my cane, let my voice waver just a touch. "Welcome to the neighborhood, son. It's a quiet place. Good people." "I'll bet," he replied, his eyes already drifting toward his own pristine, newly painted house. "Planning to make some improvements myself, really increase the curb appeal around here."
That was the first warning. The subtle implication that the rest of us, with our lived-in homes and mature gardens, were dragging down his property value. I just nodded, a benign smile on my face. After a lifetime in engineering, I'd learned that the most complex systems often have the simplest failures. A misplaced decimal point, a sheared pen. A man's character is no different. You just have to wait for the pressure to find the flaw. The flaws in Derek's character revealed themselves quickly, and they were anything but simple. They were calculated. It started with the driveway. My driveway is narrow, a strip of cracked but serviceable concrete that has held everything from Margaret's station wagon to my grandson's first car. One morning, I found Derek's massive black pickup truck parked with its passenger side wheels squarely on my property. Not just a little, a good 18 inches. It was a territorial marker, as clear as a dog lifting its leg. I hobbled out, pretending to check my mail. "Morning, Derek. Little trouble parking?" He was unloading a box from his truck bed. "Oh, hey there. Yeah, sorry about that. This beast is a bear to maneuver. Didn't want to clip my own mirror. You don't mind, do you? It's just for a minute." The minute turned into 6 hours. I minded. I minded the arrogance of it, but I simply waved a dismissive hand. "Not a problem, son. These old eyes probably can't tell where the line is anymore anyway." He smirked. That was the second time I saw it. The quick, smug curl of his lip that vanished as soon as it appeared. He thought he was dealing with a harmless, senile old man. I decided then that I would be the most harmless, senile old man he had ever met. I would be a masterpiece of frailty. The garbage bins were next. Our neighborhood has a strict schedule. Bins out on Tuesday night, in by Wednesday evening. For decades, it's been a silent ballet of civic duty. One Tuesday, I put my bin out at its usual spot by the curb. The next morning, it was still full. Derek's bin, however, was empty. I looked down the street and saw my bin pushed back almost to my front steps as if it had tried to wander home on its own. His was perfectly positioned. Coincidence? Perhaps, but engineering is the science of cause and effect. I observed. The following week, I watched from my living room window. Around 10 at night, long after I'd turned off my lights, Derek emerged from his house. He looked left and right, then casually walked over and swapped the positions of our bins. He gave mine a shove further onto my lawn, ensuring the truck's mechanical arm wouldn't be able to reach it easily. A cold anger settled in my gut, a hard knot beneath the calm exterior. This wasn't just rudeness, it was a petty, systematic campaign. He was testing the fences, seeing how much he could encroach before I pushed back. He was counting on my age to make pushback impossible. The fence incident was the escalation I'd been waiting for. The wooden fence separating our backyards is as old as I am, maybe older. It leans a little, wears a coat of moss on the north side, but it stands. It's my fence. I have the survey maps from 1983 to prove it, drawn on crisp linen paper that smells of old ink and certainty.
Derek approached me one Saturday while I was pretending to doze on my porch swing. "Afternoon," he said, his voice overly cheerful. "Beautiful day." "It is," I agreed, not opening my eyes. "I was looking at that fence line. You know, I've been reviewing the property plat, and I'm fairly certain that last 8-foot section on the east side is actually on my land." I let my eyes flutter open, feigning confusion. "Oh, that old thing? Been there forever, son." "That's the thing about forever," he said, his tone patronizing. "Sometimes people get comfortable with mistakes. I just want to make sure everything's square between us. Don't you worry your head about it. I'll have a surveyor friend take a look sometime." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Might mean we have to move it. At your expense, of course, if it's on my property." That was the moment I knew I had to act. He wasn't just chipping away at my comfort. He was coming for my property, for the very land Margaret and I had poured our lives into. He saw my age as a vulnerability, a door left unlocked. He didn't know that behind that door wasn't an empty room, but a fortified vault of memory and resolve. I coughed, a dry old man sound. "Well, you do what you think is right, Derek. You young folks have all the energy." He left satisfied. I sat there, the chains of the porch swing creaking a familiar rhythm. The anger wasn't cold anymore. It was a focused heat. I had spent my career designing systems to withstand pressure, to bear loads, to function flawlessly under stress. It was time to design one last system, a trap. And for a trap to work, the prey must believe it is entering a place of safety.
The final provocation was the shed. It's a small wooden structure at the back of my property, tucked under the shade of a large oak tree. I use it for storage, old tools, gardening supplies, and my files. My life documented in neat, labeled boxes. Derek's knock on the door a week later was accompanied by that same fake friendly smile. "Hey there," he said. "I was wondering if I could ask a favor." I leaned on my cane, making my hand tremble slightly. "What can I do for you, son?" "Well, I've got all this equipment for the yard.
A new riding mower, some ladders, tools. My garage is overflowing. I noticed you don't really use your shed much. It's just sitting there. Why don't you let me store some of my things in there? It'll keep them safe from the weather. Be a big help to me." The audacity was breathtaking. Not just using my property, but expecting me to grant him permission to do so. It was a land grab, pure and simple. Start with the shed, then maybe the garage, then who knows? He'd claim adverse possession before I was in the ground. I made my eyes go wide, slightly watery. I let a slow, confused smile spread across my face. Inside, my mind was sharp, clear, and cold as ice. I said, "Sure, Derek, go ahead. It's nice to have the company next door. Help yourself." The smirk he gave me was the most genuine expression I'd ever seen on his face. He thought he'd won. He thought the old man had folded completely. "Thanks, Pops. I appreciate it." He turned and walked away, already pulling out his phone, probably to call someone and boast about how easy it was.
I closed the door slowly. The click of the latch was the sound of the first component falling into place. The game was on. And Derek, for all his youthful arrogance, had just become a variable in an equation he didn't even know existed. He was about to learn that age doesn't make you stupid. It makes you patient. And I had been patient for a very, very long time. After Derek left my doorstep, I stood for a long moment in the quiet hall of my house. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked away, each second a measured beat in the symphony of my patience. I could feel the weight of Margaret's photograph gazing at me from the mantelpiece. She always said I had the patience of a saint and the stubbornness of a mule. "You'll outwait the devil himself, Arthur," she'd tease, using my name with a fondness that still warmed me. But I couldn't think of that name now. It was part of a past I kept locked away, like the documents in the shed. To everyone here, I was just the old man next door. Anonymous, forgettable. It was my greatest advantage. I made my way to the kitchen, my cane tapping a soft rhythm on the hardwood floors. I needed tea. Tea always helped me think. As the kettle whistled, I considered my next moves. Derek had taken the bait. Now I had to make sure the trap was sprung perfectly. He thought the shed was just a dusty old space. He didn't know it was the repository of my life's paperwork. Every deed, every survey, every tax record, all neatly organized in waterproof boxes. Margaret had laughed at my fastidiousness, but it was this very habit that would now save our home from this usurper. With tea in hand, I ventured out to the shed. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and old wood. I unlocked the padlock, a heavy, brass thing I'd owned for decades, and stepped inside. The shed was crowded but orderly. On one side were my gardening tools, a bit rusty but functional. On the other, stacked against the wall, were my files. I pulled out the box labeled Property, 1983 purchase. Inside, the deed was crisp, the survey map drawn in precise lines. I traced the property boundary with a finger. Yes, the shed was well within my land. Derek's claim about the fence was nonsense, and I had the proof. But proof alone wouldn't be enough. I needed evidence of his trespassing. I needed photos. Time-stamped, clear photos. I'm no stranger to technology. I worked with blueprints and schematics long before computers took over. But I prefer simplicity. In a drawer, I found my old digital camera, a sturdy model from 10 years ago. It still worked. I checked the battery and the memory card. Good. I set the date and time accurately. Then I thought about placement. Where could I position the camera to get a clear shot of the shed door without being noticed? The oak tree. Its gnarled branches offered a perfect vantage point. I had a small, weatherproof box I could use to mount the camera. It would be discreet, but I needed to test it. I spent the next hour setting up the camera in the tree, adjusting the angle and taking sample shots. My hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were steady when they needed to be. I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was like old times, solving a practical problem with careful planning. As I worked, I remembered Margaret. She was the one who encouraged me to buy this house. "It's got good bones, Arthur," she'd said. And she was right. We raised our family here, though the children are grown and gone now, with lives of their own. They call me every week, worried about me living alone. I tell them I'm fine, and I am. But this threat from Derek, it wasn't just about property. It was about disrespect. It was about the memory of Margaret and the life we built. I wouldn't let some arrogant youngster trample on that. The next day, Derek started moving his things into the shed. I watched from my kitchen window, the camera ready. He carried in boxes labeled tools, then a ladder, and finally a shiny new lawnmower. Each time, I took photos through the window, making sure the timestamp was visible. But I needed closer shots. I decided to risk going outside. I grabbed my cane and ventured into the backyard, pretending to tend to my rose bushes. Margaret loved roses. I made a show of sniffing the blooms, clipping dead leaves, all while keeping an eye on the shed. Derek saw me and waved, a smug look on his face. "Getting some air, old-timer?" he called out. "Yes, son. The roses need attention," I replied, my voice gentle. "Don't mind me. You go about your business." He nodded and went back to unloading. I waited until he was inside the shed, then I casually walked closer, the camera hidden in my pocket. I pretended to examine a rose bush near the shed. When Derek emerged, I quickly pulled out the camera and snapped a few shots, the sound muffled by my hand. He didn't notice. I got clear images of him carrying items into my shed, with the shed door open, showing his possessions inside. Over the next week, Derek became more brazen. He started using the shed as if it were his own, coming and going at all hours. He even stored a motorcycle in there at one point. I documented everything. Each photo was a piece of evidence. I also kept a log, dates, times, what he stored. It was meticulous, like the work I used to do. I knew I had to act soon, but I wanted him to feel secure, to think he had completely taken over. So I played my part perfectly. I'd wave at him from the porch, offer a shaky smile, sometimes even ask him for help with small tasks, like lifting a bag of soil for the garden. He'd help with that condescending patience, thinking he was humoring me. Little did he know, I was humoring him. The tension built within me. Every time I saw his smirk, I felt a cold anger. but I channeled it into my plan. I researched the homeowners association rules and county codes. I knew exactly which violations Derek was committing: unlawful storage on private property, trespassing, and possibly others, depending on what he stored. I prepared a dossier with the photos, the log, and the property documents. I was ready. But before I made the call, I had to be sure. I needed a witness or two. The homeowners association president, Mrs. Gable, lived down the street. She's a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who takes rules seriously. I decided to pay her a visit under the guise of a friendly chat. I walked slowly to her house, leaning on my cane. She was in her garden, watering plants. "Afternoon, Vera," I said, using her first name. "We've been neighbors for years."
"Afternoon," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you by?" "Oh, just stretching my legs. I wanted to ask your opinion on something. My new neighbor, Derek, he's been using my shed to store his things. I agreed to it, but I'm wondering if it's against any rules. I don't want to cause any trouble." Vera's eyes narrowed. "He's storing his things in your shed without a formal agreement? That sounds like a liability issue. And if he's storing hazardous materials, it could be against county code. You should check with the HOA." I nodded, feigning concern. "I just want to be a good neighbor. But you're right, I should look into it. Thank you, Vera." She smiled. "Anytime. You take care of yourself." That conversation served two purposes. It alerted Vera to the situation without me making a direct complaint, and it gave me a sense of how the HOA might react. I knew Vera would remember this when I filed the formal complaint. Now, all I needed was the right moment. I decided to wait until Derek had stored enough items that moving them would be a significant effort. Let him get comfortable. Let him think he's won. The climax was approaching. I could feel it in my bones, like a storm gathering on the horizon. But I was calm. I had done my homework. I was ready to spring the trap. The following Tuesday morning, I awoke before dawn. It was a habit ingrained from decades of early rises for work, when the world was quiet and the day held promise. Now, the promise was of a different sort, the promise of justice. I dressed slowly, the fabric of my worn cardigan soft against my skin. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of birds greeting the new day. I stood by the window, watching the sky lighten from indigo to pale gray. Derek's truck was parked in his driveway, a hulking shadow in the half-light. He had moved a new item into the shed yesterday, a large metal cabinet, heavy and imposing. Perfect. The more he stored, the greater the humiliation when he had to remove it all. I made breakfast, oatmeal with a sprinkle of cinnamon, just as Margaret used to make, and ate it at the kitchen table. My mind was clear, focused. Today was the day. I had waited until Derek had accumulated enough junk in the shed to make his violation undeniable and burdensome. The photos I had taken were stored on the camera's memory card, and I had transferred copies to a USB drive just to be safe. The property documents were in a folder on the table, neat and orderly. I had even printed out a summary of the Homeowners Association rules, highlighting the relevant sections on unauthorized storage and trespassing. After breakfast, I went to the shed one last time. I needed to ensure everything was in place.
The camera was still hidden in the oak tree, its battery full. I had checked it daily, like a sentinel on duty. Inside the shed, Derek's belongings were stacked haphazardly. Boxes of tools, the ladder, the lawnmower, the motorcycle, and now the metal cabinet. It smelled of gasoline and sawdust, an alien scent in my familiar space. I felt a pang of anger, but it was quickly subdued by the certainty of my plan. I took a few more photos with the camera, capturing the current state of the shed. Then I locked the door and returned to the house. The first call I made was to the Homeowners Association. Vera Dable had given me the number for the compliance officer, a man named Robert. But I decided to call Vera directly first. It was better to approach this as a concerned neighbor rather than a litigious one. I dialed her number, my finger trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the anticipation.
Vera? It's me from down the street, I said, letting my voice sound a bit weary. Oh, hello! Everything all right? She asked, her tone warm but alert. I'm not sure, I said, injecting a note of uncertainty. You remember I mentioned Derek using my shed. Well, it's gotten a bit out of hand. He's stored quite a lot in there, and I'm worried about safety. There's a motorcycle, and I think I smell gasoline. I don't want to cause a fuss, but, well, I thought I should report it. Vera's response was immediate and firm. That's not acceptable. We have clear rules against storing vehicles or hazardous materials in auxiliary structures without approval. I'll call Robert right away, and you should contact the county inspector's office. This might violate fire codes. Don't you worry, we'll handle it. I thanked her and hung up. Step 1 was complete. Next, I called the county inspector's office. I had looked up the number days ago and rehearsed what I would say. When a woman answered, I explained the situation in a calm, measured tone, emphasizing the potential dangers and the trespassing. I mentioned that I had documentation, including photos and property records. She took down the details and said an inspector would be dispatched later that day. I gave my address and hung up. Now, it was a waiting game. I settled into my armchair by the window, a book open on my lap but unread. My heart was beating a steady rhythm, not fast, but strong. I watched the street come to life. Mrs. Patterson from across the way walked her small dog. The Miller children waited for the school bus. It was a normal Tuesday, but I knew that by afternoon, normality would be shattered. Around 10 o'clock, I saw Derek leave his house dressed in work clothes. He got into his truck and drove off. Good. I wanted him to be away when the authorities arrived, so he would have to be summoned back, adding to the drama. I waited. The minutes ticked by slowly. I thought about Margaret. She would have loved this, the meticulous planning, the quiet execution. She was always the strategist in our relationship, the one who could see 3 moves ahead in any conflict. I felt her presence in the room, a comforting weight.
Just after 11, a sedan pulled up in front of my house. A man in a crisp shirt and tie got out, Robert from the HOA. He was followed by a woman in a county inspector's vest, carrying a clipboard. Vera was with them, her expression stern. I took a deep breath and went to the door, leaning on my cane as I opened it. "Gentlemen, ma'am," I said, nodding, "thank you for coming." Robert introduced himself and the inspector, whose name was Linda. "We received your complaint," Robert said. "Can you show us the shed?" "Of course," I said, leading them through the house to the backyard. I moved slowly, playing up my age. I'm so worried about the safety issues. We reached the shed. I unlocked it and swung the door open. The inspector's eyes widened as she took in the contents. She began taking notes on her clipboard. Robert frowned. "This is unequivocally against HOA policy, and it looks like trespassing." "I have the property documents here," I said, handing him the folder, "and photos showing him moving the items in over the past week." I gave them the printed photos, each with a clear timestamp. Linda, the inspector, examined them. "This is compelling evidence," she said. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Derrick. Is he home?" "I believe he's at work, but I have his number." I provided it, feigning helpfulness. Robert called Derrick. I could hear the conversation from where I stood. "Mr. Derrick, this is Robert from the Homeowners Association. We're at your neighbor's property, and there's a serious issue with unauthorized storage in his shed. We need you to return home immediately." There was a pause, and I could imagine Derrick's confusion turning to anger. Robert hung up. "He's on his way."
We waited in the backyard. The sun was high now, warming the air. Vera stood beside me, her arms crossed. "You did the right thing by calling. This kind of behavior can't be tolerated." I nodded, keeping my eyes downcast. Inside, I was a storm of satisfaction, but on the surface, I was just a worried old man. 15 minutes later, Derrick's truck screeched to a halt in his driveway. He jumped out, his face flushed. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, striding toward us. Robert stepped forward. "Mr. Derrick, we've received a complaint about you storing items in this shed without permission. This violates several HOA rules, and County Inspector Linda here has identified potential code violations." Derrick's eyes darted to me, and I saw the fury in them. "What? He gave me permission. Ask him." He pointed at me, his finger accusatory. I looked at him, my expression innocent. "Permission? Oh, son, I remember you asking to use the shed, but I thought it was just for a few small things. I didn't know you'd be storing all this junk. And a motorcycle? That can't be safe." Derrick's mouth opened and closed. He was caught off guard by my response. "You said I could use it. You said yes." "I'm an old man," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "My memory isn't what it used to be. But even if I did agree, I didn't know it was against the rules, and these nice people are saying it is." The inspector intervened. "Sir, regardless of permission, storing vehicles and hazardous materials in an unapproved structure is a violation of county code. You'll need to remove all these items immediately. Failure to do so could result in fines." Robert added, "And the HOA will be issuing a formal warning. Any repeat offenses will lead to heavier penalties." Derrick was speechless for a moment, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He looked from me to the authorities, realizing he was trapped. The smirk was gone, replaced with a look of sheer humiliation. "You've got to be kidding me. This is ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous. It's the law," Linda said firmly. "We'll need to see you remove the items now. We'll wait." Derrick's shoulders slumped. He had no choice. He started with the motorcycle, wheeling it out of the shed and across the lawn to his garage. It was heavy, and he struggled with it. Then came the metal cabinet, which required him to make several trips, his muscles straining. The ladder, the lawnmower, the boxes. Each item was carried out under the watchful eyes of the inspector, Robert,
Vera and me. Other neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. I saw Mrs. Patterson watching from her porch, and the Miller children had stopped playing to stare. Derek was sweating, his shirt stained with perspiration. He avoided looking at anyone, his focus on the task. But I could feel the anger radiating from him. Each trip was a blow to his pride. The whole street was witnessing his downfall. As he dragged the last box out, I leaned on my cane and spoke softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Next time you think the old man is easy to fool, think again.
Derek froze, his back to me. He didn't turn around, but I saw his fists clench. Then he continued into his house, slamming the door behind him. The inspector and Robert finished their paperwork, gave me copies, and left. Vera patted my arm. "You're a tough old bird," she said with a smile. "Don't let anyone push you around." I thanked her and went back inside. The house felt different now, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. I had stood my ground. I had protected what was mine. But the story wasn't over yet. The resolution would come in the days that followed, and I needed to document that too. For now, I sat in my armchair, the adrenaline fading, and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The trap had been sprung, and it had worked perfectly. The rest of that day passed in a strange, quiet buzz. After the inspector and Vera left, I stayed in my armchair, watching the street through the window. Derek's truck remained in his driveway, and he didn't emerge from his house for the rest of the afternoon. I imagined him inside, fuming, replaying the events in his mind, trying to figure out how he had been outmaneuvered by the senile old man he thought I was. The satisfaction I felt was deep and warm, like a single malt whiskey on a cold night. It wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my space, my peace. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, a different emotion crept in. Not guilt, but a weary sadness. Why did it have to come to this? Why couldn't Derek have just been a decent neighbor? Margaret would have hated the conflict. She was always the peacemaker, the one who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I could almost hear her voice, "Now, dear, was that really necessary?" And I would have answered, "Yes, my love, it was, because some people only understand strength." I made myself a simple dinner, a sandwich and a cup of tea, and ate it at the kitchen table. The house was silent, but for the first time in months, the silence felt comfortable, not oppressive. I had taken action, and the result was a restoration of order. In engineering, we call it achieving equilibrium. The system had been disturbed, but I had applied the correct forces to bring it back into balance. The next morning, I woke early again, habit more than need. I dressed and went out to get the newspaper from the lawn. As I bent down, I saw Derek's front door open. He stepped out, dressed for work, and our eyes met across the property line. There was no smile, no nod, but there was also no smirk, no contempt. His expression was blank, almost respectful in its neutrality. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head, then got into his truck and drove away without a word. That was the first sign. The second came later that day, when I was watering the flowers in my front garden. Derek's garbage bin was placed perfectly on his side of the curb, not an inch over the line. and when the garbage truck came, both our bins were emptied without issue. Small things, but they spoke volumes. The war was over, and peace had been negotiated on my terms. Over the following weeks, a new normal established itself. Derek never apologized. I didn't expect him to. But his behavior changed completely. He no longer parked on my driveway. He no longer touched my bins. He kept to his own space, and when we happened to be outside at the same time, he would occasionally offer a curt morning or evening, which I would return with a neutral tone. It was a cold peace, but it was peace nonetheless. The other neighbors noticed the change. Mrs. Patterson from across the street stopped me one afternoon when I was checking the mail. "I saw what happened with Derek," she said, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Good for you. He needed to be put in his place." I just smiled and nodded, not wanting to gossip. But it was clear that the street's sympathy was with me. I had become the unlikely hero, the old-timer who had stood up to the bully. It was a role I hadn't sought, but it felt good to be respected again.
One evening, Vera Gable came by with a plate of cookies. "A little thank you," she said. "You reminded everyone that rules exist for a reason, and that age doesn't mean you're powerless." We sat on the porch for a while, sipping tea and watching the sunset. She told me about her own struggles with a difficult neighbor years ago, and how she wished she had handled it with as much grace and strategy as I had. I didn't reveal my methods, just smiled and accepted the compliment. As the seasons turned, I found myself spending more time in the shed. I had reclaimed it, and now it felt more like mine than ever. I sorted through my files, adding new documents to the old ones. I oiled the hinges on the door, fixed a loose board on the roof. It was therapeutic, this act of maintenance. It reminded me that some things can be repaired, restored, made whole again. I thought often about the nature of respect. In my youth, respect was earned through strength, through achievement, through providing for my family. As I aged, I thought respect would come automatically from my years, from the wisdom I had accumulated. But I learned that for some people, age is seen as weakness, a decline to be exploited. Derek had taught me that respect isn't given, it's taken, it's asserted, and sometimes it has to be defended with the same vigor as when you were young. But there was no joy in the conflict, only necessity. The real victory wasn't in humiliating Derek, it was in securing my peace of mind. I had proven to myself that I still had agency, that I could still shape the world around me, even in small ways. That was the catharsis, the emotional satisfaction that went deeper than any petty revenge. Months passed. The incident became a story, then a memory. Derek and I settled into a distant but cordial coexistence. He never tried anything again. In fact, one day when a strong wind blew a branch from my oak tree onto his lawn, he actually came over to tell me about it, rather than just complaining. He said, "I can help you cut it up if you want," his tone neutral but not unkind. I declined, saying I had a guy who could do it, but I thanked him. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a truce.
I realized then that Derek had learned his lesson. He had underestimated me because of my age, and he had been soundly corrected. Perhaps he even respected me now for having outsmarted him. There's a certain bond that forms between adversaries after a conflict,
a mutual understanding that wouldn't exist without the struggle. As for me, I continued my routines, the morning coffee, the afternoon walk with my cane, the evenings spent reading or watching the news. But something had shifted inside me. The constant, low-grade anxiety that Derek had provoked was gone. In its place was a quiet confidence. I had faced a challenge and overcome it. I had used my wits, my patience, my resources. I had won. On the anniversary of Margaret's passing, I sat by her portrait and told her the whole story. I'd like to think she would have been proud, not of the revenge, but of the principle, of standing up for what was rightfully ours. This house, this land, was our dream together, and I had protected it, as I always had. The story ends here, but life goes on. The rhythms of the street continue, with new neighbors eventually replacing old ones. But I have left my mark. In a small way, I have shown that respect is ageless and that justice, even on a micro scale, is worth fighting for. A year has passed since the day Derek hauled his possessions out of my shed. The seasons have cycled through their familiar patterns. The lush green of summer faded into the fiery hues of autumn, which gave way to the stark beauty of winter, and now spring is here again, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The tulips Margaret planted decades ago are pushing through the soil, their red and yellow heads nodding in the breeze. I tend to them carefully, as I always have, feeling her presence in the garden. The peace with Derek has held. It's not a friendship, I doubt it ever will be, but it's a mutual respect that feels burned. Just last week, I was struggling to lift a bag of soil into my wheelbarrow when Derek happened to be pulling into his driveway. He stopped, got out, and without a word, he lifted the bag for me and placed it in the barrow. "Thank you," I said, and he replied, "No problem." It was simple, practical, and devoid of the condescension that once colored his every action. We've reached an understanding. We share a property line, and we will respect it and each other. That incident made me think about the measure of a man. When I was young, I measured myself by my career, by the bridges I built, the projects I completed. Then by the family I raised, the love I shared with Margaret. Now, in my twilight years, I measure myself by my integrity, by my ability to hold my ground without losing my humanity. Derek's small act of assistance didn't erase the past, but it signaled a change. Perhaps he too is measuring himself differently now. I've spent more time this past year going through the files in the shed, not out of paranoia, but out of a sense of curation. I've organized them, labeled them more clearly, and even started digitizing some of the documents with the help of my grandson, who visits every other weekend. He's a tech-savvy young man, and he showed me how to scan the papers and store them on a computer. "Grandpa, you're like a secret agent with all this documentation," he joked. I smiled and told him that sometimes the best weapon is a well-kept record. As we worked, I shared stories with him about Margaret, about the early days of this neighborhood when the streets were unpaved and the trees were saplings. He listened with an interest that felt genuine, and I realized that this, passing on memories, sharing wisdom, is another form of respect. It's a respect that comes from lineage, from history, from the continuity of life. Derek may have learned to respect my boundaries, but my grandson respects my experience, my stories. Both are valuable, but the latter is infinitely more precious. The neighborhood has changed in small ways. The Miller family moved out, replaced by a young couple with a newborn. They introduced themselves to me, bringing a homemade pie as a greeting. I welcomed them, offering advice on the best places to shop and the history of the area. I felt like an elder statesman, a keeper of the street's lore. It's a role I embrace.
Vera Gable still stops by occasionally for tea. We've become friends of a sort. She's a widow, too, and we share an understanding of loss and the importance of community. She told me that after the incident with Derek, several other neighbors became more vigilant about property lines and HOA rules. "You started a quiet revolution," she said. "I don't know about that, but it's nice to think that my stand might have strengthened the neighborhood's backbone." But life isn't without its challenges. This spring I had a health scare, a fall in the garden that left me with a sprained wrist and a bruised ego. For a few days I was laid up, relying on neighbors to help with groceries and meals. Derek was among those who offered help. He didn't come over himself, but he sent his teenage son to shovel my walkway after a rainstorm. The boy was polite, quiet, and efficient. I thanked him and gave him a $20 bill, which he initially refused, but accepted when I insisted. "Your dad raised you right," I said, and he smiled shyly. That fall forced me to confront my own mortality. I'm not as strong as I used to be, and that's a fact I can't change. But the incident with Derek taught me that strength isn't just physical. It's mental, emotional, strategic. Even when my body fails, my mind remains sharp. And that's a comfort. As I sit here on the porch, watching the sunset, I think about the arc of my life. The triumphs, the tragedies, the everyday moments that make up a lifetime. The conflict with Derek was a small chapter, but it was significant. It reminded me that I still have fight left in me, that I can still defend what's mine. But it also taught me that victory is hollow if it costs you your soul. I didn't gloat when I won. I simply restored balance. And in doing so, I gained not just Derek's respect, but my own.
The story I've told you is about revenge, but it's also about resilience. It's about the importance of standing up for yourself, no matter your age. It's about the power of patience, of documentation, of quiet strategy. But most of all, it's about respect for yourself, for your property, for your past. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: never underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who seem frail, who move slowly, who speak softly. They may have depths you can't imagine and resources you haven't accounted for. Age doesn't diminish a person. It adds layers, like the rings of a tree. Each ring represents a year of growth, of experience, of survival. And like a tree, an old man can weather many storms if his roots are deep enough. My roots are deep here, in this soil, in this house, in the memories of Margaret. Nothing and no one can take that from me. What about you? Have you ever faced a situation where you were underestimated? How did you prove your strength? Share your experiences below. I'm always interested in hearing how others handle challenges.